It's now been 3 years since the Taliban took control over Afghanistan. While there's no international recognition as the country's official rulers there, the terror group has taken part in high-level meetings with major powers in the region, including China and Russia. There's also really been no U.S. challenge on the Taliban's rule over Afghanistan, and we actually saw them carrying around and touting some of the different American equipment that was left there over the past several days. We've seen that happening. I do want to talk more about all of this, so let's bring in Javed Ahmed, a non-resident scholar at the Middle East Institute, joining us now live. Thank you so much for taking the time to be here with us today.
Great to be here. Thank you.
All right, so first off, the first question I want to talk about here, a lot of people have heard of the Taliban. They know pretty much it's a terrorist organization, and that's pretty much the extent of what most people know. So can you break down who the Taliban is?
Well, the Taliban have multiple identities. They have reincarnated time and again, not just as a radical Islamist group, but also as pure Islamists, as nationalists, as Afghan nationalists, as drug lords, even in their own words, as victims of the U.S. war on terror in most recent years. But now all of those identities have come together. They've converged and combined as they rule Afghanistan and call the shots in that country. Personally, I see them as a product of that environment, and they currently have a staying power, a military staying power, a political staying power, religious staying power, and which have further consolidated in the last 3 years of their rule, not just through suppressing dissent or removing competition and political alienation in that country, but also through torture, through arbitrary killings, through imprisonments, but also exercising, selective patronage within their own ranks through appointments or corruption to ensure internal rank cohesion and rank discipline. Overall, Josh, all of these actions have for now solidified the Taliban's staying power, which means that they aren't going anywhere in the foreseeable future.
And that's what a lot of people have been wondering is how long will the Taliban be around? Now, obviously, we've been covering the Israel-Hamas war, the situation over in Gaza for quite a while. My question for you is, how does the Taliban overall compare to the Hamas terrorist organization?
Well, it's a very difficult comparison to make, mainly because, one of them or one of these groups controls the entirety of the Afghan territory and rules the country of Afghanistan, and who aren't declared as a foreign terrorist organization by the United States, even though they're elements of U.S. designated foreign terrorists who are now today playing as governing partners of the Afghan or the Taliban rulers, like the Haqqani network. But on the other hand, you got groups like Hamas who are fighting a very difficult war with a significantly, different political context. But there's considerable inspiration, I must say, between the two sides, especially from Hamas's side on senior elements of the Taliban leadership, and many of whom have actually met publicly with the now deceased leaders of Hamas. In fact, one of the Taliban leaders attended the funeral of Hamas leader in Qatar. And I think, that one of those inspiration is the Badri 313 Special Brigade unit that I want to flag. It's also known as the Martyrdom Battalion of the Taliban. It's a unit of the Taliban's elite special forces that includes their highly trained fighters, their special forces, their quick reaction guys, their suicide forces, with many of members of this unit associated with this group that I said before, the Haqqani network. And so the Taliban has historically used these suicide bombers as a weapon of war. They publicly glorified them among their ranks as well. But this particular brigade got its inspiration from the Al-Aqsa Martyrs Brigade in Palestine, which had been involved in various military and civilian attacks, including suicide bombing. So it's a difficult comparison to make at this point, but there's greater inspiration, leadership inspiration, rank inspiration, like between the two sides.
The Taliban, if I'm correct, does have a supreme leader that rules over it, kind of like Iran. So do they serve for life? Is that kind of a lifelong position as supreme leader?
Yes, so the Taliban has a supreme leader. They call the Emir. They also refer to them locally as the Amir al-Mu'mineen or the leader, the ruler of the faithful. His name is Maulvi Khunzada. He wields the unimpeachable authority over government and society as a whole. He sees, his right to rule not just as a God-given responsibility, but also as a religiously sanctioned one. His own right to, enforce strict enforcement of God's commandments. He's a reclusive figure, who, despite the Taliban governing the country today, he has never come out publicly. And yes, he does serve for life. But then again, considering the life expectancy within armed groups like the Taliban is often shorter, which could well include, incidences of internal mutiny. I did want to, highlight one thing, Josh, is that is important is that the Emir, the Taliban Emir, has articulated his vision, not just his vision, but that of the Taliban as a whole, the unit that he's leading, which revolves around three foundational elements. Himself as the Emir, who is the paragon of virtue, the mosque and the clerics as places of endowment, places of inspiration and guidance, and then the government and the government bureaucracy as the enforcers and implementers. So all these three, which operate as sort of a triangle, they work together to execute, God's commandments, in their words. And this vision is underpinned by increased tribalism and a singular religious national identity based on Islamic nationalism. And so his approach is strikingly, I must say, constructivist, in which he sees this kind of, Afghan or Islamic nationalism as a tool by him and his ruling clerics to legitimize his demand for authority. So, and I think this is important because the Taliban very much believe that their centralized power structure allows for very swift decision-making process. It also guarantees longer-term political predictability with others, including if they want to, at some point, want to have a relationship with the United States. So to them, this is their dream emirate, an Islamic emirate, which goes beyond, a simple political preference. They believe that this dream emirate is their divine right. It's bestowed upon them by God, which gives them all the legitimacy they want, and it allows them to enforce their laws and remove and suppress those who stand against them, whether internally or externally.
And speaking about the U.S. and the U.S. involvement here, we know that we saw them kind of driving around the Taliban in some of that American military equipment that was left. We've seen that in countless videos. The U.S. hasn't really pushed back against the Taliban rule over Afghanistan. Why is that, and could that potentially change in the future?
Well, the United States has made clear that they don't want another war, that they also do not want another kind of creeping sinking in of American forces to the ground. There's certainly no visible challenge to the Taliban at the moment, be it from the United States or others. The region has largely accommodated with the Taliban as the new reality. The United States has also engaged with them selectively to ensure that the humanitarian crisis that's unfolding in Afghanistan is kept under control, that the economy has at least some kind of a macroeconomic stability, and by that through which the United States want to make sure that it does not create or compound the Afghan problems more and more. The United States has also encouraged the Taliban and non-Taliban forces to come together and engage in a dialogue to form some kind of a participatory representative government that's inclusive of most, if not all, Afghan ethnic groups, which the Taliban have so far resisted. The Taliban believes that it's their internal matter, but I'm not sure how long it could continue, as an internal matter, or how long the Taliban could continue saying that, especially if the economy that they're ruling over is still largely bankrolled by the United States as the largest supporter to Afghanistan. But ultimately, I think, the Taliban's survival will depend on whether or not they will find and reach some kind of an accommodation with the non-Taliban Afghans, perhaps in a future government that's led by the Taliban themselves, mainly because of their staying power. But all of that remains to be seen.
My last question here before I let you go, I do want to talk about the Taliban fighters, how they've actually moved into some top government roles. Can you kind of explain a little bit more about that?
The Taliban's, could you repeat that, please?
Yeah, so the Taliban fighters have actually moved, it seems, into more top government roles. Why exactly is that? Can you explain a little bit more as they've gone from fighters to government officials?
Well, yes. So it's all part of the Emir's internal consolidation approach, in which he uses appointments as the very important form of selective patronage within the Taliban ranks to ensure coherence and discipline. Historically the Taliban's fighting forces have operated. They've also recruited and fundraised using what they call the Andiwali systems or the friendship systems, and that has effectively continued with the transition of the Taliban from an insurgent group to a government now, a de facto authority, and you have people there who are closely allied with various militant groups in the region, but also transnational groups like the Islamic State of Khorasan province, but also al-Qaida, who are effectively now blended into the Taliban government, and they operate. But this is one form of the Taliban consolidation strategy. You have about 80% of the Taliban's military men who are now leading civilian institutions as senior leaders. But within that bureaucracy, which to a large extent have effectively become militarized, you also have a large number of Afghans who served under the previous government in those functional positions, who today operate on a more kind of technical side. And perhaps that's one of the things the Taliban have kept a tap over, ensuring that the economy and other things do not boil over.
All right. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us here and kind of break it all down. Obviously, there is a lot to this, so we do appreciate you being here with us. Is there anything else you want to add about really any of this before we let you go?
Well, the security has improved because the Taliban has mostly stopped killing, but it's still a hermit kingdom. The country is still a hermit kingdom. You've got the local economy, which is in shambles, mainly because the Afghan economy was never self-reliant. The Taliban seems to, be concerned about that, mainly because they don't want large-scale unemployment, which they cannot manage, or it could potentially, compound into a problem that becomes unmanageable, and which will create serious internal problems. But at some point, this hermit kingdom needs to, engage with the rest of the world, especially if they wanna rule. And one part of this engagement includes engagement with the United States, the region, but also with other Afghans, the non-Taliban Afghans. So that accommodation needs to be reached, and I'm not sure if the Taliban have reached that realization yet.
All right. Javed Ahmed, thank you so much for taking the time to be here with us and break it all down. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.